Kostova. I teach English in the English department. And this is Ari Savage, an MA student in English who works on the poetry of Celan, a German-speaking Romanian Jewish poet. I have had the privilege of working with Ari in the past year on a thesis, and I have been impressed by the depth and scope of Ari's knowledge of Celan, but also of other 20th century Jewish writers. I should know that Ari works with original text in German and Yiddish and Hebrew. So here is Ari, and I'm excited about him being here.
Hello. So, since that was the introduction, I think I start now? Yes? Yes. I don't want to between slides. Repeat? Yes, it is. Okay. Celan and the processes of survival in post-Shoah Jewish writing. Is this thing working? Is this on? Okay, we're fine. First, we should establish what the Shoah is, because the term is often unfamiliar to people outside the Jewish community, though it is infamous by another name. The term Shoah refers to the systematic attempted murder of the entire Jewish people in Europe and the successful murder of approximately 6 million, taking place from 1933 to 1945. It was one of many genocidal programs enacted by the Nazi regime. People often do not distinguish between them and refer to all of them as the Holocaust, but the specific motivations behind the programs are distinct from one another. Nazi murders of German scholars and journalists were motivated by political allegiance rather than racist ideology, for instance, whereas attempts to render Europe Judenrein, or pure/clean of Jews, were based on the conviction that Jewish people were subhuman interlopers. The Nazis' motivation renders the term Holocaust inappropriate. It is Greek for a sacrifice consumed entirely by fire. No one was sacrificed in any of these programs. The term sacrifice implies honor and exchange, not people being murdered and disposed of like garbage because of their ancestry. In Jewish culture, the term Shoah, Hebrew for destruction or catastrophe, is considered a more accurate description of events. 110,000, that is the number of pairs of shoes found in a warehouse at Auschwitz, photographed here. Over 1 million people were killed there, and for many of them, these shoes, a surplus hoarded by the Nazis for some reason, are the only remains we will ever find. According to Elie Wiesel, author of Night and survivor of Auschwitz, bodies were burned constantly, in the crematoriums and in pits when the ovens were full. Those who survived the Shoah were marked by it indelibly, and this created emotional and intellectual tensions. For many, the way to explore and relieve these tensions was via writing. Our primary example for today, chosen due to the unique complications in its explorations, is Paul Celan. Born Paul Anschel in 1920 in Czernowitz, Romania, Celan is an anagram of Ansel, an alternative spelling and pronunciation of the name. His parents were Leo Anschel and Friederico Fritzi Anschel. Leo Anschel's insistence on his son's Jewish education resulted in Paul's extensive knowledge of Hebrew language and Jewish culture. He had a complicated relationship with the idea of God, and he seldom saw eye to eye with his father's more traditional views. Fritz Jansch's interests included German lyric poetry, not surprising considering that until 1918, the region where Czernowitz stood was part of the Austrian Empire. Her preference for High German ensured it was the language Paul was most comfortable speaking and writing. Paul insisted that poetry can only be written honestly in the author's native language, otherwise the poet is on some level lying. The elder Anschels were deported by the occupying Nazis in 1942 and died in a concentration camp. Paul was sent to a labor camp instead, but his experience has changed him as surely as any other survivor. His adoptive sister, the poet Nelly Sachs, suffered the effect of traumatic stress for the entirety of her post-Shoah life, despite escaping to Sweden before she could be sent to any camp. Her native language was also German, but she could not bear to be in any country when it was spoken as a primary language for long. It was difficult for her even to travel briefly to Switzerland to accept an award, and if Paul Celan and his wife and son were not also going there, it is likely she would not have gone. This refusal to abandon their native tongue meant that the primary readership for Celans and Sachs would always be in Germany, the country that tried to kill them and succeeded in destroying their families, their culture, and life as they understood it. This exacerbated the innate tensions of survival and is particularly clear in Celan's work. These are images of the man himself. Once when death was not, you took shelter in me. That quote is the entirety of Once, my personal favorite Celan poem. It is presented here as an example of Celan's method. He placed the speakers of his poems somewhere between life and death, at least in general. This state was also evident in his own mind and prolonged his suffering, yet he felt it was needed. Theodor Adorno was a German philosopher. In 1949, he wrote that after Auschwitz, to write a poem is barbaric. Celan disagreed. Writing poetry after Auschwitz is instead the only way to discuss the unspeakable and incomprehensible. By studying Celan's work, one can observe three processes: alienation, individuation, and integration. While these are largely distinct, they do flow into each other to a degree, and they vary by the individual. Celan's third stage, integration, is particularly strange in that it was split by his poetic obsessions. Let us look at these in order. Alienation, a loss of connection to society, to self, and to one's entire image of the world. Survivors of genocide are prone to particularly acute manifestations of alienation. Destruction and death have become an overwhelming presence in their lives, supplanting potentially everything in their former existence. This is Celan's poem, Aspen Tree. Aspen tree, where leaves glance white in the dark. My mother's hair never turned white. Dandelion, so green as the Ukraine. My fair-haired mother did not come home. Rain cloud, do you linger at the well? My soft-voiced mother weeps for all. Rounded star, you coil the golden loop. My mother's heart was hurt by lead. Oaken door, who hove you off your hinge? My gentle mother cannot return. Paul Celan, 1952, translation by John Felsler. This early poem uses repeated instances of apostrophe, a poetic technique in which one addresses something incapable of reply, to express grief and anger over Celan's mother's death. She was shot by an SS officer in the throat and died as a result. Objects in the world, trees, rain clouds, stars, doors, are addressed because while they remain in the world and the dead are lost to it, neither can reply. His alienation manifested its ultimate concern for those who did not survive the Shoah, and his individuation was marked by this concern, rather than a focus on the temporal, physical world around him. He was constantly looking backward, even as he attempted to live in the present. His individuation, the process of becoming a unique individual with a sense of self, dependent on establishing connections to others and a sense of purpose and duty. For survivors of genocide, alienation breaks down the individual, and individuation must be repeated at a disadvantage. Grief, for people and for faith in people, hampers but does not forbid the process. Celan's individuation was carried out by finding work as a teacher and translator, marrying and having 2 children, though only one of them lived to adulthood. His individuation seemed to be proceeding toward functional status in society, and sometimes it was. This is Celan's poem, I have cut bamboo. I have cut bamboo, for you, my son, I have lived. This hut, carried off, tomorrow it stands. I did not help build it. You don't know into what kind of vessels I put the sand around me years ago, on behest and command. Yours comes from free ground, it stays free. The cane taking root here will still stand tomorrow, wherever your soul may cast you in the boundless. Also on 1963, translation modified from Pierre Joris and John Felsler. This poem expresses the desire to establish a legacy through family. The construction of a bamboo hut evokes the Jewish holiday of Sukkot, a family celebration commemorating the traditional barley harvest. The speaker cuts the bamboo, and family builds on it. A temporary structure is built during the holiday in which a family eats and prays, and this reference brings the broader implication of continuity of culture through descendants, despite radically changed circumstances. However, the poem also demonstrates Celan's enduring fixation on the horrors of the Shoah. The sand represents both time itself and the weight of the past on the speaker, a weight which Celan felt keenly. His focus was split between an emphasis on building a life in the present and on speaking for and remembering the lost. This complicated the final process. Integration, the process of combining discrete parts into a whole. And here it describes the maintenance of individuation over time by sustaining social connections and a sense of purpose in life. It requires a concerted, steady presence in the world. Celan's integration stuttered, periods of relative calm interrupted by moments of acute stress and depression, stays in mental hospitals, and eventually the necessity to live apart from his wife, Giselle, and his son, Eric, for their own safety. This is Celan's poem, The Vine Growers. Vine growers dig up the dark-houred clock deep upon deep. You read. The invisible summons the wind into bounds. You read. The open ones carry the stone behind your eyes. It knows you come the Sabbath. Post-Shoah, 1970, translation by John Felsler. This was the last poem Celan wrote. It was found in his notes for one of his 3 final unpublished collections, all of which eventually appeared posthumously. He recorded the dates of his compositions and visions. This one was dated 12th April 1970. Approximately 8 days later, Celan fell from a bridge, possibly by design and possibly not. And despite being a strong swimmer, he drowned. The first stanzas evoke time, darkness, and wind. Any of these can signify renewal or ending. The stone is an inevitable weight carried behind the eye in the mind, following the speaker who is known to become the Sabbath. The Sabbath in Judaism exists outside of normal time and is therefore both eternal and temporary, a sacred paradox. Celan's work placed him in constant contemplation of the dead, among them, while also among the living, a paradox too and unsustainable. Celan's eventual integration was not as a living human being, but instead as a memorial, speaking for those lost before him. In conclusion, it may or may not be barbaric to write poetry after Auschwitz. That is irrelevant because whether barbaric or civilized, one must write poetry after Auschwitz. Normal speech is not equal to the task of conveying the broken reality as seen by one who had outlived their own world. In reading his work in terms of these processes, one can conclude that Celan perpetually reopened his own psychic wounds, because if one could not understand the loss he had suffered, one could instead experience its echo, and thus it could be remembered. Celan insisted that the dead never be silenced, never be forgotten, and was willing to endure anything to ensure their memory lasted. Thank you.
Question for the speaker?
Yeah, I'm just curious, what other writers are you aware of that, wrote from this perspective as well? And do you know of any relationship they may or may not have had with Elie Wiesel?
Let's see. While I'm not familiar with very many people who would have known Elie Wiesel directly, there are definite connections between the writers of a lot of Shoah survivors, some certain similarities of experience. Obviously, the closest, I think, is probably Viktor Frankl, because they spent time in some of the same camps. Frankl mostly wrote analytically, but if you read Man's Search for Meaning, especially its narrative essay components, closely, there are some parallels to Night and to moments in Celan's poetry that admittedly require a slightly different way of looking at them because it's poetry, not prose, but they're definitely there. I don't know of any connections in terms of knowing, communicating in life, but I think there are different areas where experiences interact and you can see that in the work. I don't know if that actually answered the question.
It does. I was just, I'm just curious what physical connections were made after all of this time, and such a painful period that sometimes I think relationships were shied away from because of that. I would assume.
Many Shoah survivors don't particularly like to discuss it.
Correct.
I know one who was in a camp in China, actually, as a child, one of the less well-known ones. His family actually escaped, but were captured in Asia. He will discuss it occasionally, but only if the mood strikes him for some reason. Otherwise, he prefers to avoid all discussion. He won't take interviews about it anymore, usually, though he has given them before, and his story is recorded somewhere in an article, and I think there's some things regarding him in the Holocaust Museum in DC.
I think you see that with survivors of particularly horrific things. They are not very open to speaking about it, to your point, until it comes upon them, and it's very rare.
For those who choose to explore what's happened to them through writing, this can be a better way of releasing tension and exploring it than normal conversation, or sometimes even better than psychotherapy, though I think Frankl would probably strangle me for saying so.
Right.
I'm kidding, he wouldn't strangle.
Right. Thank you. It was very well done. Yes, very good.
Any other questions?
Ari, can you tell us a little bit about how you started this project? What got you interested and what was it?
What actually got me interested? I took a creative writing class at Alabama and was required to attend poetry readings. One of them was for a poet who works out of Georgia right now. She's also a professor, as most poets are at this point, Raina or Mark. Her collection, The Babies, has a lot of connections to the Holocaust imagery. She's a grandchild of survivors. At the very beginning of the collection, the first quote that you see, I believe it's the first or second page when you open the volume, there's only one edition, so your experience should be the same as mine if you ever hold one, is that poem. And it's in both English and German, showing me the original text and this. This is the same translation. And I thought, wow, That is striking. So eventually, I actually asked her for information about Celan because I was having trouble just Googling it, the poem itself. I got a collection of his last poems. I never really looked back.
Okay.
I actually started learning German specifically because I liked Celan. And now my German is just good enough to get in trouble or translate poetry.
Exactly. It's very interesting.
It's very good.
Yes.
Very good. I love this.
Wonderful story. Thank you very much.
All right. If no more questions, let's thank our
Thank you.
speakers.
Thank you all.
Thank you.